Anyway, hello, Martin.
Hello, Dave. So good to talk to you.
Yeah, good to see you. I one thing I wanted to kind of revisit is had a conversation with you once about how you came to visual thinking, and it wasn't like the way I came to it through art school. Can you talk for a minute about how you discovered visual thinking as a work tool?
Sure. Yeah. And it's actually my situation is one of the reasons why I wrote Visual Variation, because there's others like me who are visually challenged, who need a simple approach to visual thinking to exploit that potential. So I came at it from a solution side. I was studying problems where the solution was visual thinking. I was not particularly, and I'm still not talented. So my background is a business school and a researcher. But I found that many problems in business today, from information overload to bad trainings to lack of creativity, can be solved through visual thinking. So I came to visualization, to graphic recording, to visualizing ideas and thoughts as a solution to problems I was studying as a researcher, as a consultant, as a trainer, and just found it so incredibly versatile. But I also found that the approaches that are out there are not always useful for everybody, and especially people who are not great at doodling, sketching, drawing, that they need powerful approaches to visualize complex things in a simple manner. And that's basically also what visual variation is. It's a really simple system that enables anyone to visualize complex ideas seamlessly. Anyone that struggles like me to express themselves visually. I'm left-handed, but I was retrained to actually write with my right hand.
Oh, wow.
And that in its own right creates a challenge when it comes to the dexterity needed for drawing.
I bet. Do you remember the your aha moment, like the moment when you said to yourself, "Oh my God, this solves a lot of problems"?
Yeah, one aha moment is we were studying how teams were handling conflict in meetings. And we did so by using experiments. And we found that whenever they were visualizing what they were discussing, they did talk a lot more about issues and a lot less about people. There was much more productive conflict, if you want, than those teams that just were talking. So
Wow.
We saw that visualization is really this magic ingredient that makes conflicts more productive, because you're not attacking somebody else. You're just attacking the flip chart and a drawing on it or a doodle. And you're moving into co-creation much quicker than if you're just debating, talking. And that for me was an aha moment when I realized visualizing your ideas really is a powerful mechanism to especially think in teams better. Because you can sort of separate the criticism of the issue from the person. You're not saying, Dave, you're wrong. You're saying, oh, this drawing here, I think this part here is still missing. And that makes a big difference, that you have this thirdness that you can refer to, and then just hand the pen over to somebody else and they can add to it. And I found that, and I still find it so powerful.
Yeah, very cool. So maybe if you don't mind, you could talk a little bit about your book and how you got there and why you wrote it, and maybe give us a kind of some an overview.
I would love to. And for overview, PowerPoint's still good. So I prepared
sure.
a few slides on the book. I came through it because we really wanted to democratize visualization know-how, to make visual thinking accessible to everyone. I have a slide on that. Let me quickly go to that. Why we developed this very simple visual thinking methodology called visual variation, to democratize, if you want, what it takes to produce great visuals, and to enable clearer explanations, because I think that's what visual thinking does. It helps you to explain stuff, especially complex stuff, more clearly, more concisely, and also in a more entertaining manner, I would add, but also to enable people to use visual thinking to become more creative, right? And what we also found when we started working on the book that's now out, we could use it to sort of develop a knowledge base on complex topics, from blockchain to quantum computing to leadership approaches to how to build your resilience to better conducting meetings. That's actually a third reason why we developed it, because I wanted to sort of transform the knowledge that we have here at the business school, at the university, also my own knowledge, into accessible visual formats. And I was looking for an approach that lets me do that. And I found 5 patterns to do so. I found these visual variation patterns, and they're just a very handy visual format to convert what you know into a graphic shape, right? And that's actually based on quite a rigorous research called variation theory that says, whenever you want to convey something complex, use a simple variation that goes from simple to complex, and people will understand it quicker. The problem with that was only known by very few specialists. And so I sort of wanted to make that more broadly available, that specific approach to visual thinking that's based on visual variation, for lack of a better term.
Great.
So maybe I share an example what visual variation looks like. So this is one of the most simple examples I can think of. This is from the book Visual Variation, and I posted this on LinkedIn, and within just maybe 2 or 3 weeks, it got almost 200,000 views. So it somehow resonated with people.
I was one of them. Yeah, I remember it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that. But it's overly simplistic, but it shows the approach. You start with what people already know. For example, here, your traditional career pattern, like a stairs or steps, you slowly move upward in a organization, or you slowly increase your salary or your hierarchy position or your range of responsibilities. But that's really, I think, overcome now. There's so many alternative career paths, like the late bloomer, where maybe you are happy as an expert, and then later on in life, you also maybe want to move up in the organization, but maybe not. Maybe you've also had a leadership position, but then decide to return to what you like, right? Maybe you've had a leadership position, been in management, but then you maybe feel more comfortable being a trainer or a consultant or a coach. And many of us also have experienced roller coaster careers, right? With ups and downs, or some of us even burnout, where we had to take it slow because it was too intense. And some of us at one point, we may go into a completely different direction. And I wanted to start a conversation on new career trajectories, and I used visual variation to sort of start that dialogue. And this is a typical visual variation. We call this the scenario approach. It's super simple. You only have 2 elements to 2 arrows, but you can already explain a lot. And what I particularly like about visual variation, it stimulates you to think further. I'm sure many people who viewed this, they could add their own, career trajectory and say, I also had this in mind, that this is a career, but now maybe I want something that's really good for my development. It's not more of an upward spiral in spite of, societal expectations. So what I like about the approach is it's generative. It invites you to expand it.
You start with something like this, and then do you ask people to draw their career path, or, what?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. Or we also use it for projects. You have certain generic project developments, and then we ask them, now, what does your current project look like? Maybe I can show you that example, because in this way I can also show you a radically different kind of visual variation. It's called the segments. Right? So this is the segments example, where again I ask people, what's your current project look like? You see here the typical sequence of a project, from planning it, setting it up in terms of resources and staff, running the project, finishing it, and eventually closing, documenting it, doing the debriefing, right? And sometimes you're even done early, right? There's these lucky breaks. But then there are also many projects where you just overthink it, where you spend so much time planning and setting it up that in the end you run out of time. Or there's the opposite, what I call jump-in projects, where you don't plan enough and don't do enough setup, and then you need to cancel it because you haven't thought it through after running it for a while, right? Or what a friend of mine calls the zombie projects, where once they're finished, you still need to keep them running to clean up the mess they've created, right?
Yeah.
So this is a different kind of visual variation. It looks different, right? It's not two arrows like the one we saw before with career. This is what we call the segments pattern, where you just segment stuff into sections and show different variations of that. And then again, as you said, in the end, people can use this to sort of structure their own current project and what amount of time they've spent on which kind of phase. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I also noticed you're highlighting the slides as you go. Are you using another visual technique there?
That's just PowerPoint for you, and I find it helpful to lead people's attention. I think, especially for online meetings, that's such a powerful, simple mechanism that's built into, PowerPoint, the highlighting function, the text marker, and it just helps to synchronize what you say with what you're showing. And in one of our research projects, we asked executives, what do you find the most annoying in PowerPoint presentations? I said, when I can't connect what a person says with what they're showing. And that problem can be easily solved by just highlighting.
Nice. Yeah. So segmenting is one kind of approach. What are the other ones?
Yeah. So there's 5 in total.
Okay.
We've looked at the scenarios now for the career scenarios. You've just seen the segments with the example of the projects. The most straightforward one we call approaches. Let me show you an example of that one in a minute. The most rigorous one is called configurations. That's a very powerful one for business. And the most appealing one, intuitive one, is called mutations, where you usually work with pictorial ones with visual metaphors. And for none of them, you need drawing skills. It can be handy. But for the book, for example, I produced most of the visuals myself using tools such as the nounproject.com or simple sketches. And then maybe if you want to use it for communication to a lot of people, then you ask a graphic designer to give it the finishing touches. But you don't need to be able to draw to use most of these. Maybe the mutations, the last approach, is the trickiest one. Let me show you the approaches, the first one, and so that you can see how simple this is. This first kind of visual variation highlights and visualizes what works and what doesn't when solving a problem. So let's take the example of how to deal with setbacks, something which unfortunately we all have to deal with eventually. So this is a topic that's also known as resilience. How do you react to setbacks in a productive way? So in the approaches pattern, you just visualize various approaches to this issue. So whenever something bad has happened to you, you can sort of attack yourself and others and just, complain, or you can dwell on negative thoughts, or you can avoid it all and not face any more challenges, or you can, be eternally self-doubting yourself, or you can compensate through other things to get satisfaction elsewhere. These are not good approaches to deal with setbacks. It's much better, according to positive psychology, if you adopt one of those 2 approaches that come here at the end in this visual variation, because you always go from what people may know very well to what's new. So the new stuff is developing coping resources to deal with the setback, right? To set it aside and start afresh, to develop slack resources to absorb setbacks, right? So visualizing that in this metaphor. Or the best way to deal with setbacks is what psychologists call a growth mindset, right? Where you see it as a learning opportunity, where you frame it as something that you didn't fail at, but something that taught you a lesson that makes you more informed about what could happen. So you see the setback here visualized as a little flame or explosion. You see this as something, playful, that's challenging you, and that, okay, so you didn't score, you didn't win, but it prepared you for the next time.
Yeah, so
that would be an example of the approaches pattern. And as you can see, this was done using very simple icons from the Noun project or from PowerPoint or from anywhere. And then you create a sequence from what people know to what's new, or from what doesn't work to what works.
Cool. Okay. So these aren't visual frameworks, these are kind of ways of looking at a problem, right? One is how do you approach the problem? Segment is how do you break it apart? What's scenario? Correct. How would you call scenarios?
Scenarios are sort of reality checks for your plans. So the scenarios was the career example.
Yeah, but sort of a walkthrough of your experience or imagining
alternative situations. So in the scenario pattern, you always have a plan visualized in blue here in this example of how strategies can go astray, and reality, how reality can unfold, visualized as a black arrow. It's really extremely simple, always just usually 2 arrows. Okay. So when you, for example, devise a strategic plan as an organization, you don't always get full alignment. You get disengagement. People are not buying into your strategy and they go into a different direction. Or the strategy fades away, that you've done a presentation and people follow your lead, but eventually they don't remember it and do what they've always done. Or maybe they're distracted by external events or by other priorities. And so there's a zigzag pattern of implementation, or what I call a guerrilla strategy, that there are new emerging tendencies. And so you have an emergent strategy that maybe goes into the same direction as your official strategy, but perhaps also deviates from it. And a last scenario might be organizational burnout, that your organization follows through with the strategy, but it's not sustainable, right? Because it costs so much energy and resources.
So when you do visual variation, do you stick within one of these, or could you go across all of these ways of looking at a problem?
That's a great question, Dave. Usually, to keep it simple and clear, you stick with one.
Okay.
But sometimes you can combine it. I've seen already, I use visual variation a lot with our executive MBA students, with our master students, and it's just a guideline that we give them to get them started, and sometimes they combine it creatively. But if you want to be a clear communicator, it's best to stick with one genre, with one type of visual variation.
And how do you pick one? How do you decide which one to go with?
In the book, we have a box actually on just that topic. They are more useful for certain things and less useful for others. So each genre has its strong points and it's maybe where it's less ideal for. So just browsing through the book, because in visual variation in the book, I give pointers to which pattern or which kind of visual variation is best. For example, for planning, these scenarios are great. The segments are also great for planning, right? Whereas the mutations, they're better to highlight different types of customers or different types of problems or issues. Let me show you an example of that. But in the book, we give very clear guidelines how to pick the right pattern. And as you work with this, you also develop sort of an intuition for it. But we give very clear guidelines. So let me jump to mutations just to give you an example. Mutations take one object and then mutate it. And for example, here, to get more creative, we start with the mantra of thinking outside of the box to have better ideas. So loosen the constraints of your current situation. What would you do if money wouldn't be an issue? But then we mutate that and say, well, how about exploring the box instead of thinking outside of the box, or exploiting it more fully, or torturing the box in the sense of, shattering your assumptions about the problem, or reframing the box, right? Like Chinese noodle box, set your context differently for solving it, or taking the box elsewhere. And you can go on, right? You can say, let's mutate this further. So mutations are great for creativity, whereas configurations, they're better for analytical problems. So it also depends on the kind of issue that you're working on, and frankly, also the kind of people, right? So very intuitive people, they might prefer mutations because it's very fluid, right? And you can easily build on that and say, what else can we do with the box instead of combining it or thinking in new boxes or putting the box in a box? That's very accessible to intuitive people, whereas the configuration approach, that's more for your engineers, for your very rational people. So it also matters with whom you are working. And as I've talked about configurations, why don't I show you this last approach, the configurations approach, another kind of visual variation. And why not just show you two simple examples? The first one, and this is also directly from the book, Visual Variation, to distinguish different kinds of negotiations, we used the configurations approaches. You see, it's not as expressive, it's more diagrammatic. So here we show, for example, the difference between the Harvard negotiation method, integrative negotiation, and more win-lose negotiation, distributive negotiation, or coercive negotiation, where one party is dominating the other one and gets the larger share of the pie. Whereas in integrative negotiation, it's really a negotiation among equals. The two circles represent the two negotiation partners, and you try to make the pie bigger by finding mutual areas of interest and common positions, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's, of course, also endless negotiation when you never get to a result, and mediated negotiation, where you have a third party helping you to receive, to get to a negotiation result. So it's a very crisp approach, very analytic, with very few elements that are varied, right? Here, just three elements: the two negotiation partners and the negotiation object visualized as a circle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very interesting. So the approach is about how you approach the problem. Segmenting is about breaking it apart or comparing elements. Scenarios is like a walkthrough or imagining alternative situations. Configuration is about what are the connections and parts and how do they fit together. And mutation is working with metaphor.
That's completely that. Wow. Yeah. You're a fast learner, Dave.
No, I'm writing this down as you're talking. Very interesting.
Here's a second example of configurations that we found useful. You know, as we move from hierarchic to less hierarchic leadership approaches, right? From the left to the right, we just wanted to illustrate how the boss typically interacts with the subordinates, right? And the old model is the command and control model. You always start visual variations with what people already know, and then you take them to the new knowledge. So they already know this command kind of leadership where you just give orders, right? Or where you just check whether your subordinates have done a good job, or you instruct them, first your middle managers, and they instruct their teams, right? Or where you delegate tasks. That's a very hierarchic model. What we see today as leadership is a more egalitarian model where the boss is a coordinator, an impresario, where he or she is a motivator, right? Or just a collaborator, or in the best of possibilities, I think, a coach that enables his or her employees. So these complex leadership philosophies, you can make them very simple and accessible using the configurations approach and just three elements: the bubble for the boss, the arrow for the relationship, and the dots for the employees.
Very interesting.
That's the magic of the configuration approach. But it's perhaps not as expressive as your mutation approach to visual variation.
Okay, very cool. And so do you have any more slides you want to share?
No, I think that's it. So visual variation with these five kinds is very useful for communicating, grabbing attention, being concise, but also for igniting your creativity when presenting in posts online, in meetings. And you have five choices, basically. We found those five to be the most useful one. And you summarized them perfectly, Dave, with the approaches showing how you solve a problem, the scenarios for what might happen, the segments for what parts something consists of, the mutations as really memorable metaphors to think about an issue, and the configurations, how parts and elements are interrelated.
Okay, excellent. And so as you've been using this stuff, you can stop sharing. We can go back to faces. As you start, as you have been sharing this stuff with people, what have you learned? What kind of feedback have you gotten? What have you discovered? How do people use this? What kind of things happen, or what changes?
On the positive side, people are enabled by constraints. Restrictions are useful for creativity. The fact that there are just these 5 types, and there are certain rules, like start simple, that really empowers people to express themselves visually. That's an amazing, I think, experience when you see that constraint, like in poetry, like in literature, like in many other areas of life, constraints are useful, are creativity generators. People who didn't know they were creative are suddenly creative when you give them this recipe for visualizing their thoughts, their ideas, or their solutions. So that was one experience. These rules, these simple rules, these 5 types of visual variation that are validated by variation theory and quite a lot of research, by the way, that's something that's actually empowering. And then some people, they take it to the next level quicker. They see that they can bend these rules. This is not like medicine where you have to follow the prescription very diligently. As you master this more, you can improvise on it, like jazz musicians do, right? You can start to combine them. You can start to tweak them a bit. You can start to loosen the rules. For example, one of our rules is every visual variation should not have more than maybe 5 to 7 iterations, 5 to 7 lines or progressions. But as you just saw in my thinking outside of the box example, you can break that rule eventually. If the visual variation is not very complex, you can even have one in the book. We have one that consists of 10. But we explain quantum computing with just 2 variations, right?
You had
and not 5
in the book, or I haven't got the book yet. I ordered it, but you had in your PDF, I think you had like 5 or 6 P's that are kind of like almost like a checklist or a recipe for that. Do you have a slide for that you could share?
Yeah, but I took it out when you said I have too many slides. But I can bring it up. No worry, I'll bring it up. Because this is
I
the
just like
reduced
that one because what it does is it sort of it gives you a kind of a process that you can go through for doing this kind of work. Yeah.
Let me share the screen and show it to you. So the 7 steps for creating a visual variation. Mm-hmm. And for memorability's sake, they all start with a P.
Yeah.
Typical management scholar trying to simplify things. You always start with the why, the purpose. So clarify why you want to use a visual variation. Is this to communicate something, to explain, or do you want creativity to explore a problem? So clarify the topic, what your visual variation is about. And in the book, we use it for about 40 different topics, for leading, for living, for learning. But first be clear about the purpose, what you want it, why do you want to use visual thinking? Second, and here we give a lot of guidance in the book, in our trainings, choose the right approach, right? Choose the right template, choose the right pattern. If you have a very complex topic with people who are quite, systematic, maybe use the configuration. If you want to communicate with an audience that's quite diverse, and you want to make sure they pay attention to it, then maybe the mutation pattern is the right one. If you're planning something, scenarios is maybe better. If you want to analyze something, maybe segmentation is right. So the pattern you choose really depends on the purpose and the context. And then you have to identify what is it that you're going to visualize. As always, what are the key elements that I need to visualize and how am I going to represent them? So which symbol, which icon can I use to represent it? And here I use the nounproject.com a lot, or simple doodling sketches, or simple icons that you also have in PowerPoint. And then the variation, which different views do I want to shed on this phenomenon? Like you saw before, my career progressions, I started with the traditional view, and then maybe one that is a bit less traditional, all the way to more radical approaches. So what perspectives do you want to take on that? Or in the mutation, I showed you thinking outside of the box and then exploiting the box, exploring the box, destroying the box. These are different perspectives. And then you try to put them in the right sequence, or what I call in the right progression. Usually in visualization, you go from simple to complex, or maybe you go from what doesn't work, like we saw in the resilience example, to what works. Right? So you think about the logic, in which sequence you're going to show this visual variation. And then maybe you're also going to add some explanatory text, a few paragraphs to it, if need be. But the best visual variations, they actually don't need this seventh step. They're clear without it. So it all starts with the why before you go to the how. And you first try to think about, what is it that I'm going to visualize? How can I visualize it as simple as possible to still make it resonating? Which sort of variations should I highlight? And in which sequence should I show it? Those are the key questions in the process of creating a visual variation. Does that make sense, Dave?
Yeah, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for making time for this.